Hello, and welcome back to Restore a Planet Podcast with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Reillo, who's joining us from Florida and works for the founder of, in fact, the Rare Species Conservatory Foundation. So Dr. Reillo, thank you so much for your time. Will you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to found the RSCF?
Well, thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for including me. Yeah, our small organization is a publicly supported nonprofit based in South Florida. We function as an international NGO to the extent that we're engaged in wildlife recovery programs and projects focusing on endangered species. My background is as an environmental engineer first, an ecological geneticist. I'm a researcher, population geneticist. In addition to founding this organization in the early 1990s, as a focal point for directing tangible efforts towards wildlife conservation. I'm also the director of the Tropical Conservation Institute at Florida International University. And this collaborative effort really focuses on hands-on practical solutions, conservation problems facing critical species, critical ecosystems, how it ties toward the practitioner base of conservation, that is, people doing things to effectively save wildlife and protect wildlife, but also to anticipate and intervene where necessary on those critical issues facing wildlife in a world in crisis. And that includes the biodiversity crisis and the obvious challenges that many species and ecosystems face in the face of climate change and an ever-expanding human sea. Our organization is very small, it's very focused. We're not a zoo, we're not open to the public. The philosophy, the founding mission was to deliver practical, hands-on, tangible solutions to conservation programs and problems. And these really are directed at flagship species. And in a nutshell, what flagship species are those species that characterize and project the conservation impetus for high biodiversity worth ecosystem. What I mean by that is that by focusing on those flagship species that have functional significance to ecosystems, they have cultural significance to people, there's a historical underpinning to them, they're recognizable, they have conservation leverage. And conservation leverage is important because we can't do everything with individual species. So flagship species enable us to channel efforts that effectively protect ecosystems at the landscape level. And the flagship species, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, are very familiar, and many people are quite aware of famous flagship species that characterize and personify broad biodiversity areas.
And just on the flagship species approach that you have, and you mentioned there that you take a real sort of hands-on, direct, sort of pragmatic way of going about things. Curious, what does that look like sort of on the field as opposed to how some other organizations might think about these problems? And what is it that your work really looks like on the ground?
That's a good question. And I think, the formative issue with conservation today is where do you start? How do you make those decisions about which species to save, how to attack it, where to do what, and what is feasible and what isn't? And that's really in this world in crisis where we have so many species and so many systems that are in peril. It's a triage problem. We've got to prioritize species based on their status, whether they're endangered or threatened. What's the probability of rescuing a species from extinction? That is, if extinction is imminent, do we have a chance to thwart that? Can we stop that? Can we reverse that? And how far away from recovery is that rescue issue? So your question really leads to how do we identify which species are most deserving of our efforts? And that is a complicated matrix of decisions. It's really a very dynamic process. The first thing we look at is where are species in trouble and which species are likely to benefit in a holistic and an ecosystem way from a concerted effort for them. And that is to say, we know that forest elephant are in trouble. We know that the large cats are in trouble. We know that pangolins are in trouble. Where can we effectively make an impact that's not only going to address their conservation status from critically endangered to threatened to least concern, but also likely to protect the habitat and the ecosystems, the surrounding infrastructure and the natural world that will sustain them? And of course, there are lots of ancillary beneficiaries to that process. So the flagship species that are effective are those that leverage broad-based conservation efforts at the geographical scale, but also have this additional benefit of extending that conservation yield, if you will, to other species that we may not even focus on because they're of lesser concern or they're just not on the human radar. We look at tropics because there are certain groups of organisms that afford that conservation leverage, one of them being parrots. We know that half of all parrot species are threatened or endangered. And if you just looked at the top 50 or 60 parrot species of the 360 odd species that exist and focused on those 50 or 60 most critically endangered parrots and the habitats that are required to save them, the connectivity between that analysis and the global biodiversity issue is profound, because that habitat to protect those top 50 or 60 most endangered parrots would in fact protect about 2/3 of all terrestrial biodiversity. This makes parrots an incredibly compelling flagship species group because the vast majority of them are in the tropics. They come from areas that are under significant threat from deforestation. They're also highly impacted by climate change and anthropogenic impacts. But on top of that, by protecting those key species where they're distributed, we're going to get a lot more bang for the buck. We're going to get a lot more other species that don't have a focused conservation effort behind them to respond, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at species, critically endangered species on islands. Islands are biodiversity centers of uniqueness, if you will, with high degrees of endemism, species that occur there and nowhere else. They're also the places where critical species are most likely to disappear first, because there's no place for them to go. And as island ecosystems, particularly in the Caribbean and the hurricane zone, such as Beryl demonstrated just this week, we see high risk events. Hurricanes and cataclysmic changes can eradicate critical species in a day. This means that if we're going to be effective at protecting unique flora and fauna on islands, we've got to be very aggressive. We've got to be very effective. That conservation effort can have, obviously, leverage it's island-wide. The entire ecosystem may benefit. The same is true for species in mainland areas that may have been reduced in terms of habitat functionality to what we call insular islands. These are islands within a sea of agriculture or a sea of people, which now function much as real islands do, and that biodiversity and critical species are very much constrained spatially. And the resources that they depend upon may be very, very dependent on what we do to manage those systems and provide support for them.
What are some of the obstacles that you found in your work preventing, those interventions, and some of the obstacles that perhaps people might not think about regarding resource allocation or like a general, like we mentioned how, what at the moment sort of in flux, and perhaps concentration on things like protecting endemic parrots or various other species isn't at the forefront of people's minds. How do you think we could change that?
This is a very difficult issue to boil down to one particular pathway or one particular analysis. We're a science-based organization. We've got some great folks working with us, where we collaborate with some really brilliant people who have collated and sifted through and really analyzed the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. I think the first element is that we have to recognize that this is on our watch, right? We're here. We're alive now. What is unfolding on planet Earth is in front of us. We bear a great responsibility to do what we can while we can, because we are here and we're bearing witness to it. On top of that, what we do will largely predicate the result for future generations. So that scientific analysis to look at what's savable, what's not, is a function of, okay, first, what is it and where is it? We're talking about species that may be in high conflict areas. We know that many endangered species are highly trafficked. We know that they're conflicted by geopolitics. They may be conflicted by war. They may be conflicted by economic circumstances. the vast majority of the tropical species we're concerned about occur in developing countries, where economically there may not be the resources that those range states require to intervene and do something. So coming from the West, we have the privilege of resources all around us. People live at a very high standard of living, which people in developing countries often never get to experience or enjoy. It's very difficult to translate the difference in empathy and urgency of conservation from a Western perspective to someone who's starving and living on $2 a day. And I think the oft-adaged phrase that wildlife conservation is a wealthy white man's privilege often applies in the way we see conservation enterprises rolled out. We have to be careful about looking at that lens of conservation, I think, from a Western perspective only. And part of what we do as an organization is to try to dispel that paradigm by shifting that stewardship, that sense of identity, that sense of pride for wildlife to the sovereign states. Those range countries, those countries of origin, must have pride in their ecosystems and their species. Our role is to assist them. Our role is to provide them with resources. They can be tangible resources, financial, technical. We've done a lot with technology and wildlife in terms of surveilling wildlife, finding out how many of a particular species might be there. But the hard and fast rules of just sitting on high and pontificating about what you might like to save, and then crafting some notion of how to go about it is in fact very different from what we're seeing in real time on the ground, which is that species that the world may have known as familiar may in fact soon disappear. And we've got to get real, we've got to get serious about what we're going to do to enable a change. And that means empowering local people, increasing capacity in countries to have the technical acumen, or the technical resources, and that includes technology, as well as training, as well as access. We live in an internet world, and yet many places of the world are isolated in terms of real-time data exchange. We're going to make a difference for the big cats, for the large land mammals, for the pangolin, for endangered birds, endangered reptiles. We're going to have to be surgical in precision, but also we're going to have to be very, very aggressive, and I think very honest about what we're willing to do. And that includes our culture from the West, where we're willing to spend our money, but also in terms of the next generation of practitioners and conservationists reimagining what their lives will look like. This is not the romantic notion of what you see on wildlife TV. It's hard work. It's backbreaking work. Requires a lot of sacrifice. It's very sobering. There are very bad days. There are many bad days. Well, perhaps more bad than good. But at the same time, there's tremendous opportunity. And I think the take-home message when we look at where the needs are greatest is that a lot can be done if it is done in a concerted, cooperative, honest, and transparent way. Let's look what, in many cases, we know what the problems are, right? We know that there may be consumption. If we're talking about consumption and trade in endangered species, that's a major, major threat. How do we do that? How do we expose them? Those are things we can do. That's a human element colliding headlong into a conservation reality. In terms of the biography and of conservation and who does what, let's not make the programs about the people. Let's make the programs about the wildlife. There's entirely too much hubris and too much ego in this field. And it's the nature of human endeavors. Everyone wants to put their name on something, but that's not what we're about. We're about directing the best possible effort toward the welfare and the best interests of the species that need help.
And to bring that into a case study, like a real case study that you guys are working on Now, tell us about what you guys are up to in Kenya and the work you're doing there.
Well, the Kenya program it's focused on the mountain bongo antelope. And the mountain bongo is the largest and the most endangered forest antelope on Earth. It's a spectacular animal that is endemic to Kenya, the Aberdares of Mount Kenya. It used to be distributed across several forest ecosystems in Kenya, and now it's restricted in the wild only to the Aberdares. What we noticed early on was that, like many large mammal species that are spectacular, this was a species that was highly coveted. It was collected and traded. It was sold into zoos in the late 60s and early 1970s. And many of those animals came through the UK as they made their way west to the US to be the focus of zoological collections. There was very little done to look at the long-term well-being of bongo, even so much as to describe the distribution, ecology of bongo. And as early as 1994, when the bongo conservation and recovery effort was first conceived by one of our founding trustees and myself, we thought the bongo was effectively extinct in the wild, and it was very close to being so. We were wrong, of course, and in applying some effort toward raising the wild bongo population, we discovered that in fact there were pockets left. But in the 30 years intervening since that time and today, in fact, we've lost all of the wild bongo populations. One. At the same time, we've learned a lot about rescuing the species from near extinction. And that namely was in the form of husbandry, understanding reproduction and the sociality of the species. We discovered that in fact, we can breed bongo. We can be very effective at increasing numbers. And as is often the case in the most desperate conservation case studies, the biggest resource what we're challenged with is the species itself. We just don't have enough to afford us conservation options. You don't have choices when you don't have enough animals or you don't have enough plants. And so numbers are really, really crucial in this equation. That's why I often talk about species rescue, because if we're at the very verge of extinction, a rescue can be just enumerating a species sufficiently that you can then start imagining different conservation approaches and strategies. And that was very true of the mountain bongo. So in zoos, they weren't doing terribly well. They were kind of sputtering along. They were highly coveted. They were prized as very expensive zoological collection pieces. But the conservation effort was really lacking altogether. And what we did was discover that captive breeding can be a tool for conservation if, in fact, it returns not only the animals, but the methodology of reproducing and sustaining those animals back to the range country. Think of it as a bongo engine. If you had a bongo engine that spat out more and more bongo, you'd have a way of thinking about the future in terms of sustainable releases, translocations, and recovery efforts. And it may not just be one path, it may be many. So in fact, starting in 1994 and kind of culminating in the first repatriation, which occurred 20 years ago in 2004, an effort that we entered into with the United Nations, and both the United Nations Development Program and the United Nations Foundation. We returned 18 mountain bongo antelope from Florida to the Mount Kenya Wildlife Conservancy on Mount Kenya. And the whole idea behind that was to engage local people and government and the international conservation community in a story that connects people with wildlife, but principally returns the resource, that species, back to its sovereign state in a way that it can propagate and recover sufficiently to begin the long and very tedious process of population recovery. And I'm very glad to report that that was difficult, challenging, unprecedented, and largely successful. So much so that this year we are doing it again and establishing another mountain bongo sanctuary, which is a public-private enterprise principally local government, Meru County government, also the Kenya Wildlife Service, Kenya Forest Service, the Reillo Wildlife Conservancy, all under an umbrella that's a locally run NGO known as the Meru Bongo Rhino Conservation Trust. And our organization sits at the table with these other Kenyan partners so that we bring the science, we bring the people together, the technical expertise, the governmental units. And this sanctuary, in fact, replicates what we've done in Florida with Mountain Bongo by becoming a reproductive and population center for bongo, so that we then have options for reestablishing these creatures, these wonderful creatures, across the Mount Kenya ecosystem, where they most recently have disappeared. And the best part is that sanctuary is a twofer, if you will, because it will also be utilized for recovering black rhino, which have similarly disappeared from the Mount Kenya ecosystem. But yet black rhino are an incredible success story in Kenya because of management, because of propagation. So we have plenty of black rhinos. What we have to do is we have to get them where they belong, back into the forest ecosystem of Mount Kenya, along with the mountain bongo. And we need to do this in a sustainable way. These public-private partnerships do that. I think the UN initiative kind of laid the groundwork because it established that it could be done. And what that signaled was, while very difficult, it enables local people to and government to start thinking about how do we organize ourselves, draw in the resources from our partners, and ultimately take ownership of a program like this. We all need to work together. No one partner has all the answers. No one partner has all the resources. But together, it's a very, very strong network. And everyone benefits. The local communities benefit. The government obviously benefits. It's a tremendous source of pride. Importantly, by reestablishing these species visibly, conspicuously, in front of the very audience that has watched their decline, you engender that pride and that sense of identity again. And it's just the most heartwarming experience to see local people so cheerful over the return of their native wildlife. And of course, this propagates. This is intergenerational. This becomes the future of Kenyans who have never seen a bongo, to know that our famous animals coming back is going to do well. And that's the celebration that we want conservation to be. That the species are benefiting, and we all see that not only is this doable, but there's a great reward in it for humankind. This is a tremendous and very great endeavor, perhaps arguably the greatest endeavor of our time.
Do you think there's been a shift change in terms of approach? Of course, you guys are quite a small organization. We're quite a small organization. You've mentioned an incredible story about, I mean, literally saving species from extinction. Has there been a sea change? Do you think that the things that you've been criticized in terms of, this often imposed Western top-down approach, you mentioned how important it is to include local communities. Do you think that that message is getting across?
There's a signal to noise ratio that we're constantly pushing against. A lot of distraction on our planet right now. There's a lot of unease and I think with that, the attention span shortens. It's very easy for conservationists and conservation scientists to one another. We're speaking to the choir. And while that is a growing group, and we have a considerable body of knowledge and number of people there, it's clearly not sufficient. So one way I look at this is the challenges of scale. The world has tripled in size since I was born in terms of human population. It's not just that there's vastly more people, and that comes with a tremendous impact on the planet and consumptive negativity on this planet, natural resources depleted, including endangered species. But it also makes it very difficult to reach all the people that we need to. One way of looking at it is if you looked at how many people do we really need to connect to who could do something? Where is the wealth? Where is the philanthropy? Where are the resources, financial resources make a difference in the natural world? Well, first thing is we live in an age of billionaires. There have never been so many wealthy people. So I think when you ask about, is the messaging cutting across, and have we seen a fundamental shift in attitude? There is, I think, through the connectivity of the internet and our communications, there is a baseline understanding that, gee, things are in pretty bad shape. And there's also a general consensus that it could be a lot better if, you know, certain groups of people would reprioritize. Now, if I were sitting on the human side of things and talking about childhood diseases, one might say the same thing about that. So again, I think we have to look at our planet, particularly the natural world, in a very different way than we look at just human-centric problems. And people tend to prioritize people problems. And we spend a lot on wars and munitions and airplanes and things to blow each other up, far more than we spend on the natural world. Is that an issue of understanding? Well, yes, partially, because our decision makers and our elected officials are the ones that ultimately direct these sums of money. But I also think, you know, a lot of people are frustrated at feeling that they want things to be better, but they just can't make a difference themselves. This calls to those who have the means to become heroes, to become leaders. We know that vast philanthropy can make an enormous difference. The footprint of philanthropy on conservation can be just staggering in terms of land that can be protected and species that can be protected. We've seen it. There are case studies. We've seen philanthropists such as Paul Allen and the World Elephant Project and Global Finprint and others, and he's one of many who have invested. And there's some out there now doing some good things. But to me, the issue is, how do we recognize those true conservation leaders? Who do we turn to as that icon of conservation today? And I ask this both of students and peers. I'll pose it to your listening audience and to you. Who represents the face of conservation in the world today? What I mean, we all know David Attenborough, and that was a generational, you know, God, if you will, of growing up with that. But who represents the modern face of conservation in terms of impact and personality and resources and directing huge sums? Without naming names, it is in fact a challenge. We don't have that iconoclastic, recognizable face that unites vast cultures and people behind this very serious need. And I think if we look at that, it's not that the messaging isn't there. You know, the internet is replete with vast troves of information about endangered species and endangered ecosystems and the many organizations that are struggling to try to do something about it, including ours. That's not it. The messaging is out there for anyone who wants to find it. What's missing is that same energy that forces you to watch terrible television or to track endless noise on social media with glee, that would similarly attract you to, wow, we could be part of this. We could save it. That's something real. That would be exciting. That energy, that directed spirit of unity behind the natural world is something that calls on leadership, and it calls on money that comes with it, and we need it, and we need it now.
So you mentioned, of course, you mentioned that leadership, but I'm curious, particularly when it comes to vast amounts of money being shifted around, invested. Quite often, there's some baggage, some, the devil's in the details. What do you think are the correct set of values to go along with that leadership to really sort of steer sort of the wider sphere of people trying to do good work in the right direction?
That's a very good question, and I think it's rooted in transparency. I think people, from the decision-making end to the fundraising end, to the technical folks, to those that may not even understand or have taken an interest in wildlife or natural systems before, they need to be told the truth. We need to have an accountability for what is true in the wild, what is true in captivity, what organizations are actually doing, where the money is going, where it's coming from. It's got to make sense. And as is quite often the case, there is a disproportionate, or it might be an inverse relationship between the amount of money spent on something and the degree to which that use of money is transparent. And I find that trouble. We need to have absolute transparency because, first of all, conservation isn't easy. And it's not the case that you're always going to win. Everybody wants to win all the time. Everything's got to be a perfect, happy outcome. And of course, that's not the way it works. You can do everything right and still have a bad outcome. Climate change and novel pathogens. If COVID taught us anything, it's expect the unexpected, and everything you thought the world would be can be upended by a germ or a virus that we didn't even know was there. So the unexpected has to come with an understanding that we're in a place at a time that if we do what we need to do, we in fact can have great result. I would just throw it out there that, kind of as a tangential aside to your question, that where this field goes from here will largely be a function of extremes, right? It's going to be how far is the world going to be pushed in terms of climate change, ecosystem collapse? What are we going to lose? How does that trigger a response in the human side of it? Are we going to be content to lose big cats and elephants and whales and coral reefs? Or, as E.O. Wilson was very astute in pointing out, we have a remarkable tendency to rally at the very last minute and to do heroic things when it's really desperate enough. So is that where we're headed? Or are we more insightful than that? Do we see that, in fact, we're on a road that is not sustainable? There are a lot of behaviors that need to change. We don't have to spend a lot of money on big things. We can, for example, recognize where successes have occurred. Small organizations are often quite lean, right? They're quite efficient. We have no administrative staff. We have no office staff. Everyone does everything. We're very hands-on. And therefore, the money hits the ground. If you invest in an organization like ours, you're investing in people that live and breathe this stuff every day. And there are many other organizations that do that too. And I applaud them. Big organizations that have layers of bureaucracy and management and administration may have a big conservation footprint because they take in a lot of funding, but it also costs them more to manage it. And what happens is they often have to delegate or subcontract that work to the smaller organizations that are more precise and more surgical in their approach. I think the transparency comes back to that, where donors and funders and organizations need to recognize, look, we're good at this. We've got good outreach to the public. We can deliver the message. What we do terribly is actually getting the work done. So we need to be the face for conservation and make sure that the money that we know is there is going to where it's going to have impact. Now, that requires a lot of honesty and teamwork and selflessness, because if we're truly working to the benefit of species and habitats and ecosystems, again, it's not about planting a flag with your name on it. It's whether or not you're getting the job done. I often say, in the students I advise, if you're looking for a metric for conservation success, it's kind of idiotically simple. Species tend to do better or worse. The ecosystem is improving or it's not. These are the things that we look at, and we know how to measure these things, right? So if we're doing a good job, the first thing we might have to do is arrest the free fall, so we're not sliding down to extinction. Lessening the negative rate can in fact be progress. But at some point, you got to look at it and say, are we doing better? And if you're not doing better, then you're not doing it. It's not working. That doesn't mean you throw everything out and start over from scratch. Sometimes you do, but in many cases, what we can recognize and what donors, organizations, and funders need to see is where the work is being successful, where it's helping. every program that our organization is engaged in, we've been doing for 30 years. So when we get into something, we don't walk away. These aren't 2, 3, 5-year efforts. What we're doing with species in Brazil, what we're doing with species in Kenya, the Caribbean, it goes back the better part of 30 years. And that means you've got to have staying power, you've got to have stamina, you've got to prepare for the next generation. I can't tell you how many administrations and governments in these countries we've worked with, because there's always a successor PM or a successor president. And you have to be able to work with parties who hate each other, but may succeed each other in office. So, this is not about the people. It engages people, but is taking the long view and really investing in the long view by making sure that we're going to get there every day. A lot of wildlife can't afford a bad day. One bad day can be it. So stringing together 3,000 or 10,000 good days takes stamina and it takes effort, and we're willing to do that. And the results speak for themselves. I think the funding community, the conservation community, needs to take some real stock in that and recognize that and appreciate it, and it should be rewarded.
So finally, Dr. Reillo, for those in our audience who are interested and want to find out more about your work, support your work, donate, get involved, where can they find you?
Well, we're on all the platforms that everybody else is. Rarespecies.org is our website. We've got a Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, all of the social platforms. They're very easy to find. And we really encourage you, and also FIU, the Tropical Conservation Institute at FIU, Florida International University, so TCI at FIU.edu. These links and everything that I've said today, I thank you for the opportunity. These are just words. Right? These are words that fall rather hollow, unless we dig deep and we look at it and say, okay, I've heard something. But let's not focus on that. Stop focusing so much on what people say and really look at what's being done. And it's not because the people are doing it, it's because the work is being done. It's a teamwork approach. I'm indebted to our partners in country. I'm indebted to our donors. I'm indebted to our entire team here. We work as a unit. And our message is very holistic and in some ways, very simple, which is that we want to embrace everyone who cares about nature and a cause that is bigger than us. It is the biggest thing that we can do, because it is bigger than us. It will outlive us. If we're successful, if we've done well, this is a conversation that will be happening many, many, many years from now, and that's what I look forward to. So again, thank you for the opportunity to present the Rare Species Conservatory Foundation, the Tropical Conservation Institute, and of course we welcome questions and comments and critiques and the ongoing conversation.
Dr. Reillo, thank you so much for your time.